Welcome everyone, ladies, gentlemen, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I'm Monique Springer, Project Officer with UWIHARP, and I'm joined today with Ms. Keelan Anderson, our Project Assistant, and she will be providing some technical support for us if everything goes well. A very special welcome to our students, staff members, off-campus partners, repeat visitors, and to our new guests. UWIHARP is the HIV Sexual Health Unit at UWI, and we seek to positively influence the sexual and reproductive health and wellness of the university population and wider Caribbean society. Our primary focus is the development of sexual health literacy among the community through programs such as our digital dialogues. These are sexual health conversations and will be held during the semester. They include the S-Files discussion series on a wide range of topics and the Shock series, which will focus on sexual health issues among our vulnerable Caribbean populations during COVID-19. And today is the fourth digital dialogue we're having on the Shock series. You can look out for the flyers on our social media platforms, which include Facebook, Instagram, the UWI app, and through student UWI emails from the Office of Student Services. We do have a few participation guidelines and notices. All mics are muted and videos are turned off. Q&A will take place after the presentation and the mics will be unmuted. We ask you to post your questions or comments during the presentation in the chat pod located at the bottom of the screen. We aim to address as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Alternatively, you can message either me or Keelia directly if you prefer. For those questions we couldn't get to, please email them to uwiharp@cavehill.uwi.edu before the end of the day, and we will address them shortly afterwards. The sessions will be recorded, and the recordings will be posted afterwards on our social media platforms, including our YouTube channel, UWIHARP Cave Hill. These will be done without sensitive personal discussions to protect participants' confidentiality. Please note that we cannot guarantee confidentiality in this public forum among participants, so be cautious about what personal information you disclose about yourself and others. It's safer to talk in general terms. Please also complete the evaluation form that will be sent to you after the session. You can suggest topics that you're interested in for us to facilitate. There are a few rules of participation, and some of them were adapted, these rules were adapted from the HIV 2020 online. UWIHARP's digital dialogues provide a safe space to address a range of sexual health topics using a sex-positive approach. We encourage participants to share their knowledge, experiences, and opinions in a respectful manner. You may disagree with views highlighted today. However, please be respectful of other outlooks, regardless of your religious or moral beliefs. Let us be mindful in the way we discuss sensitive topics. UWIHARP operates on a zero tolerance policy for any kind of abusive, discriminatory, belligerent, or disparaging comments or actions that may cause distress to presenters and or participants. Persons who engage in any undesirable behaviors will be immediately removed from the webinar unannounced. UWIHARP's guiding principle is to first do no harm. And today's topic, we will be looking at 16 days of activism. And we will be focusing on intimate partner violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. And intimate partner violence describes the physical, sexual, or psychological harm done to an individual by a current or former spouse or partner. And we have a very special guest with us today. We have Ms. Marsha Hinds. She is the president of the National Organization of Women and has been an advocate, a women's advocate for many, many years. Her career spans the fields of education, media, and advocacy. She graduated from the Barbados Community College with a double major in print and broadcast media and completed a master's in lexicography at UWI Cave Hill. She's currently reading for a PhD in linguistics, and her thesis maps the development of linguistics in the Commonwealth Caribbean. Marsha has peer-reviewed articles in the areas of language planning and cultural preservation in the Caribbean. Her current research interests are the intellectual history of the Caribbean and applying academic best practices to women's advocacy in the Commonwealth Caribbean. And we are delighted to have her with us. And I wanted to start today by giving, in these series of shock discussions, conversations and testimonies from the field, stories from the trenches, as we call it, and holding space and giving voice today to survivors and victims of intimate partner violence through Marsha as the president of the National Organization of Women. Just one disclaimer, we will be focusing today on cisgendered women, and by that, I mean whose sexual anatomy is aligned with their gender identity. So in other words, I'm born with a female anatomy and I identify as a woman. We acknowledge that there are variations of this, and we respect and honor these diverse gender identities and sexual orientations. I wanted to start today, before bringing Marsha on, with her permission, to locate today the start of 16 Days of Activism in the historical context. And this is taken from the International Women's Development Agency. The 25th of November is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and marks the first day of the 16 Days of Activism. Each year, from the 25th of November to the 10th of December, World Human Rights Day, the 16 Days of Activism campaign calls for action against one of the world's most persistent violations of human rights. That's the violence against women and girls. So I will try to share. Right. So many of us are aware of 16 Days of Activism, but I'm not sure many of us are aware where it actually started or how it got started. And I wanted to pay tribute and honor these women. And believe it or not, it got started in the Caribbean archipelago 60 years ago on this very day, 25th of November, 1960. The three Mirabal sisters, pictured here, Patria, Minerva, and Maria Teresa, were political activists who opposed the cruelty and systemic violence of Rafael Trujillo's dictatorship in the Dominican Republic and were brutally killed. They were clubbed to death and their bodies were dumped on a cliff by Trujillo's secret police. The Mirabal sisters became symbols of the feminist resistance, and in commemoration of their deaths, 25th of November was declared the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women in Latin America, and this happened in 1980. This International Day was formally recognized by the United Nations in 1999. In 1991, the Center for Women's Global Leadership, in concert with the Global Institute on Women's Violence and Human Rights, called for a global campaign of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So I just wanted to put that in sort of a historical context because I don't think many of us were aware that this actually started in our backyard. And as I was telling Marsha, we want to bring it back home. But I also want, if Marsha will allow me 2 more minutes to have some framing thoughts to start the conversation. And the UNA's Executive Director, Winnie Byanyima, states that the growing evidence confirms that the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic are not gender neutral. The impacts of lockdowns and travel restrictions imposed in many countries to curb the spread of the COVID pandemic, the failure to designate sexual and reproductive health services and services for survivors and victims of violence as essential services, and the undermining of women's economic security have compounded the barriers for women and girls experiencing abuse, especially those who are trapped at home with their abusers. So with those few sort of words of intro, I then want to invite Marsha now to share testimonies and stories from the ground and in the trenches here in Barbados, because I know she was at the forefront from the very beginning when we had the whole shutdown of her experiences working with marginalized women who are victims and survivors. Marsha?
Thank you so very much, Monique. Thanks for having me, and thank you for giving us that historical context in which to think about the 16 days of activism. I certainly did not know that there was a Caribbean linkage to these international days and this international celebration. And indeed, that is what will happen if we don't, as Caribbean people, write our own history and make sure that we tell our own stories. And so I thank you so very much for invoking the presence of those women. Indeed, we continue to try our best to carry on the work that they would have done. In terms of the ground and COVID 19, COVID 19, I have done advocacy work in the Barbados space with women and girls for the last 18 years. COVID, the couple of months that have been COVID, the couple of weeks that have been the lockdown, have been some of the most difficult and traumatic weeks in all of the 18 years of that work that I have done. I think the single greatest feeling in that period was just a feeling of being inadequate, because the demand for advocacy services, the need for support, the need for food, the need for, you know, safe spaces for women, the requests for all these things were coming rapidly. And pretty much, you know, those of us who were on the ground were kind of just doing our best to meet the needs. And when the lockdown first started, I don't know how many of you remember, but there was a piece of legislation that the government had to take to Parliament to pass. And this legislation was basically to amend the way that we thought about emergencies and you know, public health crises, and how we could close down the island and what would happen, so on and so forth. I think pretty much up to that time, you know, our legislation addressed hurricanes as the major issue of that kind of scale that would impact on us. And so coming out of the legislation, there was no provision made for advocates or for civil society and the work that we do. So the lockdown, I remember the first lockdown night was a Friday night, and there was a call from the police, and they had a woman that they needed assistance with. And so I got into my car without any pass, without any right to be on the road, and I made my way to to the request. I'm sorry, the request didn't come from the police. The request actually came from a journalist who was on the road and encountered a situation and called for help. And then in the process of administering the help, I ended up going to the police station that night. But all of the time that I was on the road before I went to the police station, I actually didn't, I was breaking curfew. I did that a couple more times to take food to women, to go to women's houses to try to negotiate, you know, with family members. All of those negotiations. I don't do negotiations when there's physical violence. So that negotiation would have been more around, you know, asking family members to allow them to stay, asking family members to allow them to use food items, that type of thing. Um, and so I broke curfew a few more times to be able to do those kinds of things until we could then get the government's attention and signal them to the fact that we needed special, you know, considerations to be on the road to do the type of work that we were doing. And then we had to wait until we were given the passes for civil society, which had been granted to emergency services and essential services, so on and so forth. Um, as COVID unfolded, then, if we were having um, 3 or 4 cases, because the cases that the National Organization of Women deal with generally would be what I call the very complex cases of abuse. So these are cases that might have been in the system going from one social service agency to another social service agency. You know, the woman is still in crisis, still has not found a full solution. And invariably, those are the types of cases that we would get. So if we were dealing with 3 or 4 complex cases on a monthly basis at the level of now, Um, During lockdown, we were dealing with 3 or 4 a week. And so, really, what COVID did is that we always talk about this carpet in Barbados that we sweep everything under. COVID skin up the carpet, and everything that was under it came out. All the issues that we don't talk about: sexual abuse of children, intimate partner violence in women, and more broadly, domestic violence as well. Because what I want to do is center intimate partner violence as a type of domestic violence. Domestic violence is any violence that permeates a home environment, whether people are um, related by affinity or consanguinity. So, consanguinity being blood, affinity being individuals who decide to form a family unit together. So, within domestic violence, we have all types of violence. Um, People don't think about incest as a type of domestic violence, but really and truly it is. Elder blue, elder abuse, and of course, intimate partner violence being a very specific type of domestic violence. So not only were we seeing the fallout of intimate partner violence, but also those domestic relationships. I had a lot of cases during the lockdown of mothers and children and the unresolved issues over time, and those causing flare-ups. And then, like I said, children, and sometimes children in this sense now being women who were 20 or 22, and mommy suddenly wants you to leave home in the middle of the lockdown because there's a realization that people can't live together, so on and so forth. So it was a traumatic time, and women on the ground, um, the options for women were very limited. I remember when the lockdown first started as well, there was the help hotline that was provided by the government, by the Ministry of People's Empowerment. But that hotline was not a place, it was not in its initial what do you say, orientation. It was not meant to be a place where women who were affected by violence during the lockdown could get access to government services. When we highlighted that, um, in the paper and through other media outlets, that service was added to the hotline services. But then it was clear that, the volunteers had not been trained adequately to be able to know what to tell women when they called, to be able to connect the social services to offer an overarching solution to a woman's difficulty. And that overarching solution was not only a problem during COVID. Our social services are not interconnected. Generally, before COVID, outside of COVID, they're not interconnected to ensure that women who are affected by intimate partner violence can get one seamless, solution to their problem. So really, during COVID, our ability to provide services to women impacted by intimate partner violence was not present, and that is because outside of COVID, it is also not present. Some of the things that I saw during COVID, I saw women who took physical blows and had physical injuries. There were women who were reporting sexual abuse. And the sexual abuse sometimes was not only of them, but it was also of pubescent girls, girls who were, the expectation was that they're in the house and they want shelter and they want food. So there should be sex passing for shelter and food. One of the other things that I also encountered during COVID was a lot of children who did not have safe space. So, whereas there are a lot of houses in Barbados where there are 10 or 15 people living in the household, um, and outside of lockdown, individuals can take a bath in the morning, they can have breakfast, and they can leave the family space. We talk about the block and that kind of thing without recognizing that the block is a part of an ecosystem in some communities where it enables a household that is overcrowded to have space. So with that block space now locked off during lockdown, everybody is at home. And that child who isn't going to school because safe space, a part of the ecosystem for that family is also when that child goes to school, but there's no school. And so those children are in between a household of people, you know, of very diverse backgrounds. Some of them with drug addiction issues, some of them with mental health issues. Even if they're not issues at all, just the fact that there are 15 people living in a very small space. So we also saw a lot of children who did not have safe space during the pandemic. Um, and we also then got calls from schools and other individuals who wanted us to do wellness checks. So there were some teachers, when they finally got to that point where they were doing some school online and that type of thing, there were some teachers who were not seeing certain children. And because of, the perceived home environment or whatever, you would get a call or two asking to do a wellness check on a child, that type of thing. So those are some of the major things that we would have seen on the ground. Some of the other things that we would have seen, your home. So there are some partners, and like you rightly said, all of my work focuses on women and girls and cisgendered women and girls mainly. We do have, same-sex women who will come for advice and that kind of thing, but largely I have to accept that it's cisgendered women and it's women who are intimate partner relationships with men. And so they're home, and the man thinks the woman should not be talking to anybody on WhatsApp, regardless of who she's talking to. It could be a mother, it could be, a friend from work, whatever, but he doesn't feel that she should be on WhatsApp. So we had a lot of what I called WhatsApp jealousy, that showed up in the space as well. And women who were saying, well, he's not otherwise abusive. He has never gone on like this before. But because, the two of them were sharing space and he expected that all of her attention should be his, that caused some issue as well. So there were a gamut of things that, obviously I want to get the testimony of women out there, but I also don't want to talk about any one particular case in a way that exposes anybody. But that's a lot of what we were seeing on the ground. I could talk a little bit, if you want me to, then about some of the things we encountered when women went for services,
Yes,
which
of
was
course. Of course.
okay. So, one of the first things that we recognized is that there had not been a thorough thinking through of the provision of sexual health services when the lockdown first started. So I remember, for example, I had a pregnant woman who had started to bleed, and she was unclear about how she could get attention during the lockdown period. And it took us about a day or two to figure out, what it is that she should have done. Um, and, so I think that when we went into lockdown, we thought about the hardcore things. We thought about, the provision of food and supermarket services and those type of things. But I think it took us a little while to come up to speed with the soft issues. I know by the end of lockdown, nurses at the polyclinics who are responsible for women's clinics and that kind of thing were calling patients to schedule patients and that type of thing. But like I said, that we got there as we went along. At the beginning, none of that had been put in place. One of the other things that quickly also we realized is that there was no coordinated plan for the provision of abortion services in the public health sector. And again, like I said, these are not things that happen during COVID and they just pop up during COVID. Access to abortion in Barbados is something that I think we need to relook. Of course, abortion in Barbados has been legal since 1982, but there are issues around access. If an individual has money, if it's a moneyed woman, there is no problem because she can make an arrangement with her private gynecologist and she can have the service done. The services sometimes range anywhere from $1,000 up to $1,800. And so, like I said, if you're moneyed and you have that, you can have your abortion done. But women who are depending more on these services through the clinic and the hospital, there are still horror stories about access to these services. And so I contexted it to say that this problem with access to abortion services is not something that COVID created. It's a problem that was there that was exacerbated by COVID. And so we had a few women um, who called in to ask, what should we do to be able to secure these services? And I remember one woman in particular wanted to have that as an option, wanted to know what to do because her partner had actually hit her. And, from what she said, it was such a significant lash that she was concerned that something now might be wrong with the baby. So she was thinking of having an abortion as a way to, I guess, to be able to mitigate against any danger that he had caused, so on and so forth. So that was one of the issues that was complicated. Um, we also were slow in terms of being able to signal to women that there were mechanisms that they could use uh, to be able to report various types of what do you say, things that they were encountering. um, we had a lot of the police saying, this is really not our job. When women had situations that they wanted addressed to, and used the police as a first port. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that it was the police's job, but what it took us a while to understand was whose job exactly was it. And so there were some women, who would have made that initial overture to the police to hear, well, this is not exactly something that we can deal with, but without the police being able to say, okay, this is where you need to go, or this is where you need to have this issue addressed. One of the other things that was concerning to us was the classification of who was essential in this crisis. The childcare board officers were not on the road during the COVID lockdown. So remember, you heard me talk about doing wellness checks for some children because that is not a service that anybody else was offering. There's a statutory body in Barbados responsible for the care of children. And I couldn't really understand how during a lockdown period, they were not categorized as essential services. In some cases, we had um, cases ongoing with the police, and the police, seeming, this is my interpretation, seeming to not know how to get in contact with a child care board officer, if they felt that a report needed to be made, so on and so forth. Welfare officers were at work. However, the way that their office was structured made it difficult from my vantage, which is I stand right next to the victim. So my vantage is the same vantage that victims have. So from my vantage, standing next to the victim, it took way too long in a lot of cases to be able to address the issues that people were presenting with. One of the things during COVID, like I said, two people simply cannot live together. It's not safe. So that woman needs to find immediate housing, immediate shelter, and going to welfare to be able to get that shelter, and it taking, you know, longer than I would hope that it would take. In terms of the police, one of the upsides, because I talked a lot about, some of the challenges, but one of the upsides of COVID is that we had a centralized court for the granting of protection orders. That was the District A court. Everybody was coming to that court to have protection orders done, and it worked like a dream. Um, Women were getting protection orders in 2 days, 2 days turnaround, which normally doesn't happen in the court. The process of them swearing the documents that you have to swear to get the protection order, all of that was very streamlined. The services were also very streamlined and almost real time. And I remember we had a kind of like a post-mortem session of some of the COVID situation. I remember saying to the AG across the table, please don't change that part back, We are happy that COVID has made it so easy to get a protection order in Barbados, because that part really worked well. And one of the other things I think it drummed home is the extent to which women were using court services to be able to get protection orders, and the extent to which it was taking up court time. So I think having it all concentrated in one court really drove home to the officials. And some of them, mentioned as much when we were on the courtyard and stuff. They were like, Marsha, where are you finding all these people? So I think it really gave them as well a very clear sense of the pervasiveness of the epidemic that is intimate partner violence um, in Barbados. One thing that I forgot to advocate for, and I take personal responsibility when we considered protection orders, because I did have a conversation with the chief magistrate when we were going into lockdown to ask him about how the court system would work for protection orders and women who needed that service, so on and so forth. What I did not ask him about, and what did not have a solution during COVID, was the maintenance system. The maintenance court was closed, and there were women who were fighting to put food on the table for their children. The fathers had put money into the court system in the names of their children, and that money sat in the court system during the lockdown, while these women, were dependent on food hampers and dependent on other type of charity to be able to feed their children. So if there's something that we need to fix, it is definitely that. Maintenance as well has to be seen as an essential service, because women need money to buy food and to buy resources during a lockdown. So that's kind of some of the stuff that we were seeing. The Queen Elizabeth Hospital went above and beyond. They always do. I find that in accident and emergency, they're very good at being supportive to victims of intimate partner violence, and I can't say different. The doctors always um, huddle together to be able to provide a service that is comfortable to the victims and that is supportive of victims, and that would be my summation. With the police, it depends on which police station you're presenting to. Although I must say that Commissioner of Police Tyrone Griffith, Commissioner Griffith, during COVID, we had a meeting and I outlined some concerns that I was having to him, and he gave me real time solutions to those problems. So whereas in the rank and file of the police, it is very much which officer you get on which day at which station. I would say largely in the top brass of the police, there is a very victim positive, supportive structure at that level of the police. And if there's ever a reason to complain, it always feels like that complaint is taken seriously, and like if something is done to address the complaint. So that was, some of how the system worked during COVID, kind of the good things and the things that we could do differently the next time round.
Marsha, thank you so much for sharing. I have so many questions, and I acknowledge Christina Hinds, Dr. Christina Hinds, who hosted 16 days webinar earlier this morning. So Christina, if you have any, or anyone else has any questions or comments, and again, welcome to our participants, visitors, staff members. I see a few, and former peer educators. Very happy to see you. Marsha, before I guess open the floor to other questions and so on, there's something I wanted clarification on. You were talking about the police, but I wasn't sure if this was a person that had a sexual health concern, if this was the pregnant woman you were talking about that was bleeding, that called the police, who didn't know what to do. But it was at some stage the police didn't know what to do or what to respond to. Maybe if you could clear that up. Is that question clear?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, I think what police grapple with in the Barbadian space sometimes is how can they get involved in a domestic violence situation if a hard crime has not been committed, right? Because the police will tell you that their responsibility, their interpretation of their responsibility is we are crime fighters, right? So if you have a woman, for example, who says, I am getting a food voucher from whoever she's getting the food voucher from. My husband takes the food voucher, he goes and he spends it, but he doesn't give me money, food from the voucher, right? In some instances like that, where it's, for the lack of a better word, soft abuse. It's not soft abuse, but the police, from a police perspective, they don't see it as something that police have involvement in. So I was talking about those types of situations. And so, a woman is going and she's saying, this is happening. And the police are saying, well, I can't do anything. Or even if I take a statement, there's no charge that I can associate with that, right? And like I said, I didn't say it to chastise the police, because I understand, where they're coming from. Whether I agree or not is different, but I understand where they're coming from. But then if it's not the responsibility of the police, whose responsibility was
Right.
it? Is the point that I was making.
Yes.
I had
Okay. No,
another
I
case,
understand now.
sorry.
Mhm. No, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I had another case where a mother wanted her adult daughter to leave. Um, and so she called the police. And the police came and they told the adult daughter she would have to leave she had a young baby, a newborn baby at the time. And I said to the police, well, this doesn't feel like a solution to this situation to me. And his response was, if this is the woman's house and she doesn't want this other woman living here, then I have to advise the woman to leave. And in a lockdown situation where a woman has no resource, she has no other place to go, I understand how the police thinks that is a solution, but that's not a solution. So it got complicated sometimes. And what I want to say here now that I'm talking about it is that obviously when you're doing the work on the ground, well, at least the way I do my work, I coordinate with other advocates across the Caribbean, because I'm not the only one. And in Trinidad, they were having a slightly different experience, because Trinidad, Trinidad and Tobago's police service now has a domestic violence unit that has civilians working with police to create solutions to domestic violence situations. So because they have social workers, psychologists, a whole a coordinated response, their advocates weren't having that issue of women going into the police and being spit back out the other side without what do you say, a holistic
Safety net. Hmm.
approach to the issues. So it's about the work that we still have to do.
But the Domestic Violence Act here in Barbados does not include economic violence.
It includes economic violence on paper. However, that piece of legislation has never been tested. So we have never had a case of financial abuse in Barbados or emotional abuse that has been tested before the court. The police always look for the harder issues. So if there is physical violence, that's what they will prosecute. If there is sexual violence, that's what they will prosecute. And that is one of the biggest travesties, I think, with that 2016 Act. The Act is comprehensive. However, a lot of the Act remains untested. And that is something that, all of us have to pay attention to, and lawyers as well. That's a good way to make a mark in law, because we do need to have some of those cases of emotional abuse and financial abuse, especially tested. Financial abuse uh, is one of the types of abuse that came to the fore during COVID. People who did not allow women access to food, um, people who made women sign over checks and then could not get the proceeds of the very check that the woman had signed over. There were a lot of strange things that happened. women who were forced to sign checks and then people take checks to the bank. And it makes you wonder, if you go to the bank and you write a check sometimes and you don't dot the I properly, they send the person back to you and they say, no, 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 we can't cash that because it needs, it's not written properly, whatever. But then you have a whole man who can take a check to the bank with the permission written on the back from a woman, and he's getting resource. I mean, and I had a conversation too with the head of the banking association during COVID, coming out of some of the complaints that we were hearing, to discover that there are not a set of protocols that govern, that protect women and girls in Barbados from financial abuse. So the banks see financial abuse as a type of fraud, which I suppose it is. However, with our system the way it is again, if you go into the bank and you say, well, look, I get $200 a week and my boss writes me a check. And when I come home, my husband he forces me to write pay to on the back and sign my name. No police force is going after that $200 check that belongs to that woman as a case of fraud. So let's be honest about it. If we just categorize it as fraud and leave women out there to fight between the bank and the police to recoup their money, they won't be able to recoup their money. So we also are not putting mechanisms in place at the level of the bank to be able to protect women, and that women is across the gamut. Because remember, we hear about elderly's pension checks that go missing as well. So remember that we are talking about across the gamut when we talk about financial abuse and women, and there is not enough that is being done to insulate victims of that type of abuse.
Wow. And well, that is just so disturbing and unsettling. I wanted to pick up on something that you said earlier in your conversation about the social services not being interconnected. And of course, that's very, very concerning and very disturbing. But I also wanted to ask if then you were tapping into other NGOs, CSOs for this support, like for example, Barbados Family Planning with regards to SRH services and so on, particularly in the case of the um, the the lady that was pregnant, that was bleeding during her pregnancy, that those types of steps that you had to take.
Right. So the National Organization of Women, and I'm glad you raised that because it was in the back of my mind when I was talking about the work that we were doing. The National Organization of Women is an umbrella body of 11 groups that work in the women's and girls space. The now what do you say, mechanism can only function because we have the support of
Right.
those 11 groups. So that includes I Am a Girl, it includes Optimus International, Barbados Association of Muslim Ladies,
Okay.
Women of Purpose, a whole, and I've forgotten some and I apologize for that, but there are a whole 11 groups. And or collective work is that work that those groups do. So, for example, the Barbados Association of Muslim Ladies during the lockdown were offering services for women in their community, right? Because we know that the Muslim community, they pull together as a family and as a community. So it doesn't make sense me going to try to offer services to Muslim women when Muslim women are already there who have the training and the expertise to be able to support
Yeah.
other Muslim women. If they need help or support or whatever, they are capable, more than capable of reaching out and getting that information and taking it back to the community. There were a number of groups under us, Women of Purpose, other groups, Mothers Union, who
Mhm.
were doling out food and who were trying to help mothers who might not have been capable of administering homeschool, because we assume that everybody can homeschool a child, or assist a child to be able to benefit from online or remote learning, and everybody can't do that. So we
Exactly.
had other women who were hand holding women to be able to make sure that children benefited. There were NGOs that were collecting used items such as, people's cell phones, people's laptops, and redistributing them. to other children. We had spaces that were open where people were saying, well, look, I have this bed, I don't know how it will help. But and generally, like I keep saying, everything that happened during COVID was was a magnification of what happens outside of COVID. Because very much as well, that kind of support we get outside of COVID. It is because of the graciousness of individuals that we're able to do the work we're doing. And one of the most awesome things that this work allows is a space where a woman who was drawing on advocacy services 3 months ago can call and say, listen, I have a bed and I know it can help another woman. Come for this bed for somebody else. So you now move that woman from a point of vulnerability to a point of empowerment because she now joins back to give back to. And that's how we sustain a lot of the work that we do. So yes, now very much was working with the groups and affiliates under us, as well as other NGOs in this space. Um, and we did a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and at the end of the day, there are a lot of NGOs now who have expended their entire budget for the
Yeah.
year um, during COVID.
Yeah.
And I think it is now a conversation that we need to have moving into next year because we recognize that our tourist season now is in some crisis and that we won't have, I guess the type of comeback that we were looking for as the rest of the world moves into lockdown due to the second phase of this pandemic. So we have to have a conversation now so that at the
Yes.
end of March, when people need help again with food support, when people need help again with, you know, rent support, all of these things that come up, how are we as a country going to be able to provide that support? Because whereas we were able to take a lot of the brunt in this first wave without the assistance of the government, I humbly don't think civil society is in the position to do that in the second wave because resources expanded. And then a lot of people who have been in our donation circles and that kind of thing, they too have faced shortened work weeks, lost jobs, can't do it anymore because they now have two or three members of their own family that they have to divert that resource to. So we have to have a conversation. We
Yeah.
can see it coming. So we don't have to wait until it gets here. We can have a conversation and start to articulate.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for that, Marsha. I do have a couple of other questions, plenty questions, but I thought I would ask Kelia if there were any questions or comments that you're seeing from the participants.
Hi everyone. Yes, Money. I have one question. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we
Okay,
can.
fantastic. Thanks, Marsha, for sharing. Um, Hearing stories of any kind of trauma, violence, or abuse is really, really hard. So I'm even at a loss for words right now because sometimes we don't know of the situations that some persons are facing, and we often take many things for granted as opposed to reaching out and helping where we can. So thank you very much for sharing and bringing these issues to the fore. And I hope that those that are in this call that can assist in any way will do so in any way possible.
Well,
We
let me
have
tell them
one.
one of the tangible ways. Sorry, just very
Mhm.
quickly coming off of what you
Sure.
said. So
Yeah.
Optimist International has opened a food bank, and we have partnered with them. And so any items, baby milk, baby pampers, are two of the most in demand items, as well as just tin food. And the good thing about doing a food bank is that you don't have to go and buy a box of tuna, one tuna, one tuna, one tuna, one tuna feeds a family. Rice,
Okay.
flour, sugar, those kinds of items, we would be more than happy to receive those in any quantities.
And where's your drop off point?
The drop off point is at the Seroptimus Village in Warrens.
Mhm.
I'm going to leave my personal cell. It's all over the place anyway. The number is 253-8426. Anybody who wants to donate and doesn't know where that village is can give me a call and I can facilitate to get the donation coordinated. If you have a donation but you don't have bus fare, we completely understand that too. So we could probably, collect from Monique at UE or something like that, so that we're
Yeah.
not making people expend resource.
No problem. Thank you so much for that. Um, the question is, what are some examples that are considered economic and emotional abuse that could be tested in court, in your opinion?
Oh, great
Okay,
question.
great question indeed. So, what I was talking about, one of the ways that abusers usually take away financial abuse, take away financial resource, for example, like I said, they make victims sign over checks and that kind of thing to them. There's absolutely no reason why something like that cannot be tested in court because it's not legal. Some of the victims are not even signing the checks. The signatures are forged. Okay. So at the end of the day, that is something that can be tested in court quite easily, I think. But what we need is an appetite among lawyers to do that type of work. Emotional abuse has a very clear definition in the law in
Mhm.
Barbados, right? And so if what we have been doing is enabling victims to be able to do things like journals, where every time something happens, you document what happened. And if you have a victim who is enabled enough to be able to document and provide a log, then emotional abuse can also be tested in court because it is outlined as a type of abuse in the Domestic Violence Protection Orders Act. So, but these things, financial abuse and emotional abuse, they take a little more time than a slap does. But I always say emotional abuse is the super abuse because in order for you to financially abuse somebody, physically abuse them, sexually abuse them, you have to first get them in that position of mental
Yeah.
vulnerability to be able to do it. So, in my mind, and from what I see working with women and girls, if you address the emotional abuse, you can arrest a lot of the rest of the type of abuse that individuals
Mhm.
face. And we
Mhm.
heard this in Christina's very, very, very deep, very troubling
Painful.
panel about the link between, for example, sexual violence in childhood and violence in intimate partner relationships in adulthood. Sexual violence can't start without emotional abuse first. Children are groomed to enter into sexual activity with adults, right? So imagine if we could do a whole lot more to be able to enable girls to hear these red flag words, write them down, you know, cry out for help. Not only cry out for help, but get that help. Could we be saving one or two or more of them from that cycle of abuse that starts in their childhood? So there are cases that can be tested.
Oh, great answer, Marsha. And before in our pre-conversation, pre-webinar conversation, I said, well, between the two of us, and you did it just now, spoke about, the childhood violence. And then I said, well, from Professor Jones, it's very painful to listen to these testimonies.
Mhm.
From her presentation, we certainly got the systemic, intergenerational, and inherited violence and trauma that somehow we don't talk about or make the link or name it that way. And I think that's really something that needs to be addressed because very often we talk about and blame mothers for not taking action for girls who were sexually violated. But I don't know that we ever stop to think, well, maybe she was sexually violated and doesn't know how to respond, right? Certainly in
Absolutely.
my own research on menstruation, when women spoke about their mothers didn't tell them anything. One of my participants said, well, she probably didn't know what to say because no one ever told her. So it makes me think about maybe when the particular example that Professor Jones spoke about, one of the women's mothers who was raped in front of her, and she too was raped in front of her child. My heart bled, and I said, well, this is where we go with the intergenerational trauma of sexual violence, and which leads into physical violence as well. Keely, I
I
think there
met
was
a
some.
particular, sorry,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I met a particular lady during this lockdown period, and I know that she wouldn't mind me talking about this story because she's actually looking for platforms where she can tell her story. She had three daughters. All three of her daughters, she discovered, were being molested by her husband, her estranged husband. And, in doing the interview and in trying to understand the case, she too had been abused as a child. And when I asked her, but didn't anything, when you heard your daughter say X or Y, wasn't that familiar? Didn't it sound, you know, didn't it trigger something in you? But what it triggered her to do was to shut down.
Yeah.
She didn't want to be dealing with it for herself. She didn't
Again,
want to
yeah.
be dealing with it for her children. So I just, when you were talking, I thought about that story because the trauma is real and trauma can paralyze people. I think a
Yes.
lot of us
Yes.
rationalize intimate partner violence. Oh, he can never do that to me. He can never do it to the you who is not broken, who is in your rational state. But like
Not
I always
vulnerable.
say, the emotional abuse happens before the first lash
Oh
to
yeah.
get you
Oh yeah.
beyond that
Mhm.
rational state, to get you in that broken place where the rest can happen, right? So we have to start to thinking about the impacts of intimate partner violence, the impacts of sexual violence, and how they're cyclic because they are very cyclic.
Correct.
Yeah.
Thanks for that response. Great response, Marsha. Kelia, the other comments or questions?
Yes, they are. Dr. Hines is asking, she said this morning, I listened to Professor Jones talk about victim shaming and how it hinders reports of abuse. How can we help people through this? And then we have another question that's asking, is there a lot of victim blaming in Barbados?
Oh yes. Oh, big
I think
time.
that's global.
Yeah.
Big time. And how do we fix it? We have to train our police, welfare officers, childcare board officers, social workers in the hospitals. We have to, and when I talk about training, I'm not just talking about somebody with a whiteboard saying gender is not a biological feature. I am talking about creating spaces where people get to dig up in their own
Oh yeah.
biases, privileges, misconceptions,
Mhm.
Experiences.
religious mess, experiences. We have to start to deconstruct the individuals that we place in these positions of power and reconstruct them to be the supportive individuals that we want them to be. I'll tell you something.
Oh yeah. Well
There is
said.
not a good relationship between myself and some of these service providers, and the primary reason is our difference in understanding and approach to victim. If I
Mhm.
take a woman to you who needs a food voucher and a house, don't ask me why she got six children from seven men, because frankly, I don't care. Doesn't make a difference. And it doesn't mean that because she has made those life choices that she deserves to be beat, that she
Exactly.
deserves to have her money taken away. I'm sorry. So at the end of the day,
Correct.
the only way that you can fix that is to create spaces where we really delve down. And we also need accountability. When a woman comes into a station at 12 o'clock at night and says, my husband made me sign over my welfare check and I don't have nothing to eat, sir, I hungry. Sir should not be only able to tell her, so will you come if you want me to do? Right? Sir should have to fill out a form that gets the information as she has relayed the information. And if Sir determines that there is nothing that he can do under, the law or whatever, that he has referred her and
Yes.
that Sir will make sure that the file is sent to
The right
whatever the collection. Of
person.
course, we
Mhm.
don't have a central mechanism for the collection and the address of victims of intimate partner violence in Barbados. We do not have a case management mechanism. And that's one of the things that we need because SIR should be sending that case then onto the case management mechanism so that somebody can follow up with that woman in 2 weeks' time so that she doesn't fall through the cracks, right? So the woman is getting the welfare check. The man forcing her to sign it and give it to him So then she goes back to welfare hungry. But she'd have just in here last week. We ain't get she money last week. What she come back in here for? And it is impossible because she doesn't know where to go. The police on the one hand telling her there ain't nothing they can do. The welfare on the other hand looking at her sideways. You know what I mean? And these are the positions that we stick women into. And violence doesn't only happen in the home. Domestic violence also has a community component and it has a wider society component. So when we do those things to victims, we are actually victimizing victims all over
All
Re-victimizing.
over again.
because you're making the vice grip that this person has on their life tighter, right? So he can afford to tell her, no, well, you could go on to the police. Go on to the police. You went on there for me last week. What happened? Look, I still here. Right? And so she starts to believe that. She starts to believe, why should I go? Because he's right. I could as well tuck in and keep my mouth shut because nobody ain't listening,
No point.
you know? So these are the things that we have to look at. Training and accountability, two big ones. Our system is broken. Doesn't make any sense pretending that it isn't. It is broken and we need to fix it. And right quick too.
Wow. Marsha, I'm here trembling, huh? Just because this is painful.
It's a
Just
lot.
because this is painful. Um, and because we are coming close to we're at the end, but I know I have a few more questions, but I think I want to maybe end off. Keely, are there any other questions or comments in the chat or directly to you? I wanted to
No,
ask
no,
that big
isn't.
question, your call for action. Let's say we need to go, into another lockdown, and given the broken system that we have, the gaps in our system, the fractured system, what would your recommendations be in this call for action should we go to another lockdown?
My call for action, I'm going to make it real simple. One, to the government. We need to have a daily committee. If we go back into lockdown, we need to have a daily committee with oversight over all aspects of the COVID pandemic, not just how many infections we have, but we need to have a team of about 12 individuals, 12 of our brightest, 12 of our best. Each of those has three responsibilities, right? You can probably put access to services, response to intimate partner violence, and maybe the care and protection of children. To give you an example, those three would belong to one professional who is trained and who then is able to feed in with respect to those three crises or three issues or whatever, so that we have a bird's eye view on the entire pandemic and not just how many COVID infections we've had, um, you know, over the period of time. So we need that oversight committee so that the island is more manageable in terms of how people are experiencing the lockdown and what people need to thrive in the lockdown, right? And the people are who are on it, they don't have to be paid. They can be volunteers because that's national duty, right? They can be relieved from whatever office it is that they have and put on that committee. That's for the government. In terms of at my level, one of the things that I would like to see, there are now three young social workers who are working with me, learning advocacy real time. And what I want is for us to start to think of advocacy services as a necessity. I can't tell you really how I've done this work over the 18 years that I've done it the way I've done it, except that it has been a healing for me. It has been one of the ways that I have processed and managed my own trauma, right? But everybody doesn't have the experience that I have, and everybody can't approach the work that I have the way that I have. That is in a volunteer capacity, not being paid for it. So, my call to action is for us as a community of people who understand, right? Because when you see this work, you see some people pop up all the time, a Monique, a Dr. Hinds, like same people all the time. I want us to start to think about how we can create a pot fund around these three young ladies so that they can carry on this very important work. Because to have an advocate sit next to you in a chair in the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning when your face is completely disoriented from a lash is something that is priceless. And I've learned that because my victims have said it, but also because I see the empowerment and I feel the empowerment that has happened in spaces like those. So those would be the two call to actions. Hopefully the government act, but if they don't act, then how can we come together and create this potluck that we can support these young ladies in terms of paying them to be able to do this work? Because with everything that's going on now, when I was doing this work, my children were in school during the day. So at least I had that period of time to recuperate, to cry, to help another victim to do whatever. But these women are seeking now to do this work with their children on their hips because it's remote school. So they can't do it the same
Wow,
way.
true.
So I want them to be empowered to be able to do the work.
Great, well said. And I just want to close then with something that I came across from UN Women, and one of the, of course, there's a lot of work being done on 16 Days of Activism. The executive director of UN Women, Fumzele Mlambo Nka, and she says that the COVID-19 pandemic not only is a public health crisis, but it's also a humanity crisis. And it's running the risk of reversing decades of progress in poverty reduction and exacerbating already high levels of gender-based inequalities. And of course, we're seeing violence. So I really want to thank you, Marsha, for sharing your stories. I'd like to thank the participants who joined us today. I'm really hoping that you're able to not only take away very valuable experiences, but if you're interested in continuing this work, either at the academic or volunteer or NGO level. And also thank you to Kelia for providing some technical support. Join us next week. We will have our last shock webinar for the semester. We'll be focusing on World AIDS Day, and we will be having testimonies from HIV positive persons, one living in Barbados, and from Jamaica, from the Caribbean Vulnerable Community Network of persons living with HIV, to hear about their experiences of living with HIV during the lockdown. I hope you will be able to join us. I know this is a difficult time in the semester. People are getting ready for exams and coursework and so on. But if you can join us. We'll also be posting the videos on our social media platforms, so you can always have a look at them. If you need to refer to them, you can look on our Instagram page, Facebook, and the YouTube page, all UWIHARP KPL. Great, so thanks everyone, and enjoy. Yes, I really moving testimonies and conversations today. As I said, the first one and only one, hopefully, that was giving me chills today. And I really respect and honor your testimony and the women that have gone through these difficult periods. Okay, everyone, thanks again and enjoy.
Before you close,
Yes,
can I have Marsha share that telephone number with me again?
Sure, 253
84
26.
253 84 26. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and take care.